Oh man, am I gonna save you so much grief with this video. If you watch it and if you listen, I will save you shame, confusion, problems, grief, anger. Let's talk about scope of practice. I'm gonna share with you things that I was trained in. But I've been coaching for a long time, and eventually, of course, I was like, how bad could it be? And so I've made some big mistakes. Let me tell you a story. I had a student, and he thought I could help anybody. He was blown away by my work. So he was like, please, Peter, please work with my brother. He's depressed, but you can help him. And I was like, okay, let me talk to him. So first one on the list, do not work with clinical diagnosed depression. So I get on the phone with him, and within 2.5 seconds, he is crying. Literally 2.5 seconds. We get on the phone. He is crying. He is telling me he wants to kill himself. He wants to die. Okay. Second one, suicidality and mental illness are a no-no. Also, I find out that he's recently gotten sober and he's an alcoholic. Also a no-no. And so we talk, and I think to myself, I've got this pressure from this other person who thinks I can do anything. And I really want to help this guy. He sounds like he's suffering. And I'm trauma informed. I've worked with complex PTSD. I have a lot of training. I have therapeutic training. I was like, I can do this. But I'm not sure. Let me check. So I went to my dad, I went to different people, and I got their thoughts, and what I came to was this. I decided on a set of best practices. 1, he had to continue working with a therapist. 2, he had to continue working with a psychiatrist. 3, he had to be doing some kind of exercise, Pilates, personal training every week. And so I began to work with him. We committed to a 6-month contract. Now, as you can imagine, it did not go well. I tried all my tools. All of the tools I tried, they didn't work. Why? Because he was depressed and suicidal and mentally ill. He had a handle on his addiction, and he wasn't relapsing. But the point is that I just failed over and over again 24 times. And it was really humbling for me. But there was a sense of like, this man is not talking to the right person. Really, at the end of the day, the only tool that worked with him at all was being with him exactly as he was. That was it. But none of the tools of coaching worked. So a few others. So clinical anxiety, active addiction, mental illness, active suicidality, clinical depression. We do not work with these things. The reason is that you are not going to be trained to work with these things, and they require specific tools. We will not be talking about them. I don't know them. There is an important point. Some people will say, oh, I have depression, or oh, I'm anxious. Now, lots of people experience depressive feelings, they experience anxiety. That is different than a clinical diagnosis of an anxiety disorder or major depression. Those diagnoses, we do not work with those people. Often if people say, I have depression or I have anxiety, I won't say, okay, I'm not working with you immediately. But what I do say is, how do you know? Tell me a little bit more. When you say depressed, is it, well, I feel sad a lot? Is really different than, I really struggle to get out of bed, I don't feel pleasure anymore, it's really, I can't get myself to do anything. Or anxiety, I don't leave the house, I can't interact with people, it totally interrupts my daily life. Those things are real problems. Feeling sad or down sometimes, having anxiety that's not at the level of a disorder is something that's very normal. If you say yes to working with these people, what you will find very quickly is that you don't have the tools to help them. And there's all kinds of challenges and problems that can arise. Again, like if you are working with someone and they're suicidal, and then in the course of their work, they kill themselves. And I have a friend who did work with someone and they did kill themselves. It can have a big impact. It can bring up a lot of pain and questions of, did I do the right thing? Should I have connected them somewhere else? So we really want to avoid these things. They're not in our scope. So let's talk about another one. So, trauma, complex PTSD, abuse, all of these different things, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse. We do not work with those things. I know that many of you are very familiar with trauma. You may even be trauma informed. You may have a lens to look at the world through of everything is trauma. This is a lens that I also have, many people have, where we look at the world, we've trained in trauma, and we see trauma everywhere. Now, that's a valid lens. It's really valuable to be able to look and see trauma, its impact, where it shows up, where it's being created. But if we look at through that lens, we go crazy when we put that in the context of the scope of practice. If we don't work with trauma, it's like, oh, at the same time, there's a way in which we're always working with trauma because we're working with people, and all people have trauma, right? So this doesn't mean you can't work with anyone who has trauma. That would be 0 people on the planet. If someone does have significant trauma that they're working through, guess what? What are the best practices here? They have to be working on their trauma with a therapist. We are not going to be working with trauma. If someone brings up a traumatic event, there's a few things that you will never do. 1, get them to tell their story. We're not going into the stories about trauma. Number 2, we're not going to go into feelings, like feel it, like be there, go there, exaggerate the feeling. When it comes to trauma, no. We're also not going to have people go into a space of expression around areas of trauma. How will you know that people are in trauma? Usually they'll tell you. That makes it really easy. I had this traumatic event, words like trauma, abuse. When you hear those words, again, we don't work with story, we don't go into the past, but those are areas where you're not going to go diving deep into their feelings about that. You can stay in the present moment. You can talk about how that's impacted them. You can talk about what they want to create in their life moving forward, but you're not going into the past. You're not going into people's trauma, period. If you get trained in trauma, and there you have certain tools and distinctions, then you can make that decision. But for the scope of what you're learning from us here, these are the things that you will not do. Now, occasionally you will see trauma show up in the way that people are experiencing a moment where they're hyperventilating, dysregulating breath, their eyes become off. These kinds of things can happen inside a coaching container. It's life. Trauma comes up to some extent, and then we would just go into a grounding. reconnecting, feeling the earth, feeling gravity, connecting with the present moment in various ways, and bringing them out of this state of trauma. So again, we are never going into trauma. At the same time, you don't want to make people bad and wrong. I was in a coaching, I have a lot of classroom trauma, right? In my school, I had a lot of struggles. So academic environments are really hard for me. And I was in a coaching training, and I named that I had some trauma stuff coming up for me. And I named a few different symptoms, and the leadership freaked out. They were like, oh my God, we don't work with trauma. You don't belong here. You have to get out. And it was a horrible, horrible experience. Now, luckily, I was trained in trauma and I was trained in coaching. This was my third coaching training that I was doing. So I was like, stop. No, you are wrong. You do work with trauma. You work with it every day. I was like, what I'm experiencing is normal. And then I looked to the room and I said, raise your hand if you experience symptom 1. Boom, half the room raised their hand. And I did that again with everything I experienced. And it was totally normal in the room. It had been happening for other people. So it's not that when someone has trauma, you go, oh my God, I don't work with that. What do? You invite them back into the present moment. That's it. You bring them back to the present moment, to their breath, to the regulation, and you get them present to their desires, to their goals, to what they want to work with, to a sense of safety. You're going to connect them with resource. We'll talk about resource more later. You're not going to go into the trauma. So these are the no-go zones. Your scope of practice is the present moment going into the future. It's about moving your clients toward goals and working with anything that gets in the way, unless it's one of these things, in which case you do what? You refer out. So take a moment and just consider, I would invite you to write down for yourself, if there's anything else that also seems out of your scope, like what you personally don't want to work with. The more clear you are about what you don't work with, the more you're going to find a fit with your clients and the more integrity you're going to have with yourself.